It was just after 10:03 a.m. when the tension in the chamber changed. The hearing had barely begun when the stillness cracked. Not with a shout, but a question. From the elevated bench, Justice Clarence Thomas adjusted his glasses, eyes fixed on Jasmine Crockett, like a prosecutor sizing up a witness, not a fellow public servant. The setting was deceptively formal, an oversight hearing on equal protections under federal law, specifically the implications of recent LGBTQ+ rulings. But the real trial, it turned out, was personal. "You ever argued a case before the Supreme Court?" Thomas asked, voice calm, but sharpened with something colder than skepticism. It wasn't curiosity, it was challenge. Jasmine, seated alone at the front table in a midnight blue suit, didn't blink. "No," she replied, each syllable clear as glass. "But I didn't need to be a Supreme Court justice under federal ethics investigation to understand what injustice feels like." The air shifted, audible now. 3 seats down, a clerk stopped in typing. The room, a cavernous federal chamber lined with wood panels and carved seals of justice, fell so silent the cameras might as well have been on mute. And then it happened. A murmur. It started as a cough from someone in the back row, but caught like a match. A soft gasp, a camera click. Then, unmistakably, the sound of restrained, startled laughter. Not mockery, recognition. Of power, of reversal. What happened in the next 30 minutes didn't just resolve a tense public moment. It exposed something deeper about power, dignity, and truth in America. If this kind of story keeps you listening, like the video, comment your state and local time, subscribe for more voices that won't be silenced. Jasmine didn't gloat, she didn't move. Her hands remained lightly folded on the table, the thin stack of papers before her untouched. What she said hadn't been rehearsed, but it had been prepared. Not in words, but in every room she had walked into and been questioned. Every law library she had studied in under whispered doubts. Every courtroom where her silence had been louder than someone else's resume. Clarence Thomas cleared his throat, not to respond, but to reassert control. "This committee convenes under order," he said. "It is not a space for personal grievances." She turned toward him, not with hostility, but with something steadier. "I agree," Jasmine replied, her voice even. "But I didn't bring personal history into this hearing. You did, when you questioned mine." There it was, not a battle of credentials, but of who decides what counts as credible. Jasmine didn't rise from her chair, didn't raise her voice, but everything in her posture said, "You called me to justify myself. Now, I'm calling memory to justify you." Outside the chamber, the headlines were already forming. Clarence Thomas clashes with Repression Jasmine Crockett. Moment of reversal, who gets to question whom? But in the room, the real story wasn't flash, it was stillness. The kind that builds just before truth breaks loose. 2 rows back, Senator Ramirez leaned forward, eyes fixed. He had seen hearings derail before, but never with this kind of quiet precision. Crockett wasn't out to humiliate. She was out to unmask. Because the question Clarence had asked wasn't about the law, it was about permission. Who gets to belong in spaces like this? "I didn't clerk for a Supreme Court justice," Jasmine continued. "I clerked for justice in public housing courts, family courts, broken systems that don't trend on cable news." She flipped open the folder before her, revealing just 2 documents. Printed, double-spaced, unhighlighted. No theatrics. One is a deposition from 91, she said. It's about a young attorney being asked whether his behavior disqualified him from sitting on this nation's highest bench. She paused, letting the silence hold its breath. The other is from last year. A list of undisclosed gifts, vacations, and financial ties traced back to that same justice. The same one asking me if I'm qualified to speak about fairness. Clarence Thomas's expression didn't shift, but something in the way he gripped the bench edge said everything. Not fear, not guilt, just a sudden awareness that the room, for the first time in a long time, did not belong to him. One of the younger court aides, no older than 24, glanced at the second row where his mentor, a veteran clerk, mouthed a single word: "Watch." Jasmine didn't press. She didn't pull out receipts or timelines. She simply looked across the bench and said, Sometimes the people who've suffered under a system understand it better than those who've benefited from it. In the back row, a woman whispered to her seatmate, "That line's going viral." But Jasmine hadn't spoken it for virality. She had spoken it because it was true, because she knew something that wasn't written in law school textbooks or court precedent. Power listens differently when it's being reminded of its origin. And Clarence Thomas, whose own confirmation hearings had once rested on silence and skepticism, now sat in a room where that silence had returned, but it wasn't working in his favor. He leaned toward the mic again, almost reflexively, but this time no sound came out. He hesitated. For a man who had weathered storms in nomination battles, shaped major rulings, and rarely spoke from the bench during oral arguments, this moment wasn't about speech. It was about gaze, and Jasmine's eyes held his, not with fire, with memory. The hearing resumed moments later, but something in the room had changed permanently. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just answered a question. She'd reframed the hearing entirely. It wasn't about her credentials anymore. It was about who dared to ask that question in the first place, and why. The moment passed, but not really. It lingered in the fabric of the room, in the way eyes didn't quite return to their notes, in the way staffers typed with more caution, more intention. It wasn't the words that unsettled the chamber. It was the fact that Jasmine Crockett hadn't raised her voice and still managed to shift the center of gravity. From the bench, Clarence Thomas resumed his posture, shoulders squared, fingers folded atop the leather edge of his notes. But the cadence of his presence had shifted. A kind of stiffness had set in, the kind that comes not from authority, but from being seen. Jasmine had returned to stillness, her fingers tracing the edge of the manila folder she hadn't yet opened fully. She wasn't preparing an attack. She was preparing a mirror, one that power rarely dares to look into. A senator from Georgia attempted to pivot the conversation back towards statutory interpretations of LGBTQ+ protections. A few nodded, a few looked relieved, but Jasmine remained quiet, her eyes still trained on her notes. Not because she didn't have anything to say, but because she knew how words land when they arrive on the back of silence. It wasn't about her qualifications. Not really. It never had been. The question had been asked before. In job interviews, where her degrees were never quite enough. In courtrooms where opposing counsel triple-checked her bar status. In donation letters returned unopened. Because we're focusing on more experienced candidates this cycle. Always coded, always polite, always clean. And yet now the court had made it official. It had spoken the doubt aloud. You ever argued before the Supreme Court? No one asked Clarence Thomas that when he was nominated. At least, not until the hearings turned to something deeper than credentials. Character. Jasmine looked back at him, then down, then spoke again. Since we're discussing credentials, she said, let's talk about how easily they're forgotten when history is inconvenient. There was no response, just the sound of a pen tapping from one of the media rows. I was a first-year law student when I read Anita Hill's testimony, she continued. We studied it not as law, but as literature, as performance, as politics. I remember one professor saying, no one remembers the accuser once the robe is on. She closed the folder now. That's not true. I remembered. Clarence Thomas shifted. And I remember that this court, she added, her voice tightening like a drawstring, once weighed your past and found it irrelevant. But today, when I speak of equal protections, you find my path uncertain, my voice premature? That line turned every head in the chamber. I'm not asking for your seat, she said. I'm asking you to stop guarding the door as if justice is something you built yourself. Gasps were suppressed, but not silenced. From the back row, a C-SPAN intern leaned forward so far, her headset cord yanked from the jack. Thomas finally spoke, his voice low and steady, but with an unmistakable edge. Congresswoman, you're not on trial here. Jasmine nodded just once. No, she said softly, but dignity is. And there it was, the frame. This wasn't about her resume. This was about the rituals of power, about how black women are made to climb ladders twice as tall just to stand on floors half as stable. How every room entered is treated like a test, in every calm rebuttal, a threat. The chairman called for a recess. The gavel echoed too hard against the desk, more like a crack than a call. Outside the chamber, phones lit up. Headlines scrolled like sirens. Crockett challenges, Thomas intense exchange over credibility. History echoes as court faces mirror moment. Inside, reporters whispered. Clerks shuffled. But Jasmine remained still. And in that stillness, something opened. Not in Clarence Thomas, in the room. Because this wasn't just a disagreement between two public servants. This was a diagnostic, a reckoning, a study in how authority reacts when someone it expects to fold instead becomes the quietest fire in the room. An aide brought her water. She didn't take it. Her hands were steady, her breath slow. Years ago, she had walked into a courtroom in Dallas where the bailiff had mistaken her for the defendant. She hadn't corrected him, just proceeded to win the case. That was how she had learned. Credentials didn't grant her permission. They gave her a sword. She wasn't here to perform. She was here to stay. Because what Thomas had questioned wasn't her capability, it was her presence. In that seat, in that hearing, on that level. But here she was, not blinking. You ever argued before the Supreme Court? No, but she had argued for tenants facing eviction during a snowstorm, for single mothers denied health care by algorithmic bias, for teenagers profiled by zip code before they ever reached a courtroom. And all of that counted, whether the bench accepted it or not. As the court reconvened, Jasmine sat a little straighter, not out of pride, but preparation. Because the question had been asked. Now it was time to ask one back. When the hearing resumed, the air felt thinner, like something sacred had been pierced. Not broken, but punctured just enough to release a truth too long compressed. Justice Clarence Thomas adjusted his robe, carefully. He didn't look at Jasmine Crockett as the chairman reclaimed the floor. A procedural pivot followed, some brief remarks about precedent, the limited scope of today's inquiry, the need for decorum. But the room wasn't listening to him anymore. They were watching her. Jasmine hadn't spoken during the recess. She hadn't texted, hadn't checked the news on her phone. She'd simply sat, index finger slowly tracing the crease in the folder in front of her. There were 2 pages left, 2 she hadn't yet unfolded. Not because she wasn't ready, but because the timing mattered. And now it was right. Mr. Chairman, Jasmine said quietly when the next opening arrived, with the committee's permission, I'd like to enter a statement into the record. No objections, no delay. The room leaned in, not physically, but emotionally. Even the ones who disliked her politics couldn't look away. Jasmine rose, her blazer crisp beneath the long fluorescent lighting that made most people look pale and tired. She looked clear. This statement isn't for rebuttal, she began. It's for record, because records, unlike rumors, last longer than reputations. The first document was a clipped article from the Washington Post, dated October 15, 1991. Ethics concerns surround Supreme Court nominee. She read a few lines, not with venom, but with gravity. Descriptions of financial disclosures unfiled. A mention of private flights. A whisper of conflicts. Never confirmed, never fully disproven. The second document was dated April 2023. ProPublica had published a follow-up. Only this time, there were receipts, trips, watches, tuition payments, and the same name threaded through them, Clarence Thomas. She didn't say it to shame him. She said it to show something older than either of them, the way power shrinks accountability into a rumor and swells doubt into disqualification when it's pointed in the other direction. I've never argued before the Supreme Court, Jasmine said, but neither did Thurgood Marshall when he started dismantling segregation. She folded the articles slowly, methodically, and slid them back into the folder. What qualifies someone to speak on justice, she asked the room, but looked directly at the bench. Is it courtroom experience or courtroom survival? Because I've done both, just not under chandeliers. Clarence Thomas inhaled slowly. The silence begged for response, but still he said nothing. She stepped forward now, just slightly, enough for her voice to carry more directly. This court does not belong to robes. It belongs to the people it claims to protect. And if my experience doesn't match yours, maybe it's not my credentials that are limited. Maybe it's your imagination. The phrase landed like a stone in a still lake. No splash, just ripples. A reporter 3 rows back mouthed the line, already knowing it would anchor tomorrow's front page. Jasmine didn't wait for applause. None was coming in that room. She simply returned to her seat, the quiet click of her heels the only sound. Clarence Thomas finally looked up, eyes catching hers, but he didn't speak. Because in that moment, there was nothing left to question. Only something left to reckon with. It was J.D. Vance who tried to change the subject. His voice cut in quickly, attempting to draw attention to legal precedents, to 14th Amendment interpretations, to the proper channels of judicial critique. But the rhythm of the room had already changed, and Jasmine knew it. She sat quietly, listening, hands folded. But there was power in that posture. It wasn't meekness, it was memory. The kind that doesn't just recall past insults, it catalogs the patterns behind them. Years ago, a judge in a county court in Texas had looked down at her during a pretrial hearing and whispered, not quite under his breath, "You sure you're in the right room?" He meant it as a jab. She took it as prophecy, because now here she was in the highest room, not asking to belong, being it. The irony, of course, was bitter. Clarence Thomas had once been called unfit, once doubted, once framed by innuendo, questioned for motives, whispered about behind polished smiles. And yet here he sat, asking another black public servant to prove her legitimacy under lights he once stood beneath himself. But Jasmine didn't call him a hypocrite. She called him history, because what he had forgotten, what he had forsaken, was that the system that once doubted him didn't get fixed just because he survived it. It had only learned to doubt in more refined language, to cloak its suspicion in questions about credentials, to imply that lived experience is lesser than academic citations, that if you speak from the margins, you better have a Harvard degree to translate it first. And if you don't, then you get the question. You ever argued before the Supreme Court? But Jasmine had flipped the script, not with a retort, but a revelation. She made the question itself look small, and she made dignity, hers and that of so many others, look impossible to measure with titles. When the hearing finally paused for the lunch recess, the media gallery erupted, not with applause, but with electricity. Typing, calling, scrambling to reframe the story that 20 minutes earlier had seemed a routine exchange. A young producer from MSNBC turned to her senior editor and said, "We just watched a woman put a Supreme Court justice on trial without ever raising her voice." The editor nodded, and without even standing up. It was just past 1:40 p.m. when the hearing resumed, but it wasn't the same room anymore. You could feel it in the way people sat, straighter, quieter, no longer watching to be entertained, but listening for something deeper. It wasn't just oversight anymore. It was exposure. Jasmine Crockett hadn't dismantled anyone. She hadn't embarrassed Justice Clarence Thomas. What she had done was worse. She had taken the question he asked her, intended to diminish, and used it to reveal how often this country mistakes power for purity. Now the bench looked smaller, not physically, but spiritually. Justice Thomas returned from recess with his expression reset, composed, almost preoccupied. But his silence was too practiced, too tight around the edges. That's the thing about pride. It knows how to hold a face even when the hands are shaking. The chairman called the hearing back to order, but eyes didn't return to him. They returned to her. "Congresswoman Crockett, if you'd like to continue your remarks." She didn't hesitate. "I would," she said, standing slowly, "but not for myself." And she didn't gesture to her folder this time. She gestured to the front row of the gallery, specifically to a black woman in her late 50s, hair pulled back, eyes red-rimmed from emotion. A court stenographer in a tailored green jacket, off-duty, Jasmine later explained, but not unfamiliar. "This is Deborah Martin," Jasmine said, 22 years a court reporter. She's transcribed trials where children were sentenced as adults, where language was used like a cage. She's never asked to sit at a microphone, but she's seen more miscarriages of justice than most judges on this panel. The room stilled again. Deborah sat frozen. Jasmine didn't dramatize her. She just named her, made her real. "Justice Thomas," Jasmine said gently, "you asked me whether I'd argued before this court, but I've read transcripts Deborah typed in 1998. Cases where sentencing laws left no room for mercy, just mandatory minimums handed down like vending machine codes." She turned back to the room. "Do you know what it's like to argue for a client while their past is the only thing the judge sees?" She paused, just enough. "It's not about how many courtrooms you've spoken in, it's about how many lives you've spoken for." And then she let the silence bloom. One by one, the people in the gallery stopped fidgeting. Phones lowered, pens froze midair, because they were witnessing something rare. A person refusing to accept power's invitation to perform, choosing instead to tell the truth and letting the weight of it do the work. Clarence Thomas spoke again, this time not with sarcasm, but control, measured. "Congresswoman, with all due respect, this hearing is not about your personal journey." Jasmine didn't flinch. "You're right," she said. "It's about the journey justice takes through each of us." And then, for the first time in the entire hearing, the room exhaled, not in laughter, not in awe, but in recognition, because in that moment, Jasmine stopped being just a congresswoman. She became the question they'd all been avoiding. Not is she qualified, but why do we keep needing someone like her to prove it? Clarence Thomas sat still, but inside the reckoning had already begun. Because deep down he knew, once he had sat in a seat like hers, not in title, but in tension. He had once been the one doubted, not because of ability, but because of how his truth made others uncomfortable. And now he had become the questioner. He had become the test. The irony wasn't lost on Jasmine, but she didn't weaponize it. She honored it. "I studied your early writings, Justice Thomas," she said, "your opinions on prosecutorial discretion, on the power of precedent. I even quoted you in my senior thesis." She smiled, but not warmly. "It's strange," she said, "to be told by someone I once studied that my experience doesn't count." No response, only a sharp intake of breath from somewhere on the panel. And then, like a thread pulled from the lining, it all began to unravel. One by one, other voices began to shift. Representative Delgado, usually reserved, began citing disparities in sentencing data that mirrored Jasmine's points. Senator Goldstein asked the committee to revisit ethics review protocols. Even a conservative colleague, Representative Merriman, made a tentative nod toward transparency reforms. The room had changed direction, and everyone knew why. If that moment hit you too, don't just sit with it. Comment below, share the story, subscribe, not for us, but for the truth still being erased. And as the chamber quieted again, Clarence Thomas finally spoke, not to her, but to the record. "Let it be noted that Congresswoman Crockett's documents are entered into committee files." It was procedural, safe, but Jasmine heard the note beneath it, permission, and she didn't need it, because she had already proven the point. You don't need to argue before the highest court in the land to understand justice. You only need to survive the silence it leaves behind when it turns away from people who look like you. There was something about the way the gavel struck the wood this time. It didn't sound like order. It sounded like containment, as if Justice Clarence Thomas was trying to close the moment before it spread. But it was already too late. Gasps had become murmurs. Murmurs had become momentum. And momentum in a courtroom like this is the one thing even precedent can't always hold back. Reporters weren't just covering a story anymore. They were watching it unfold in real time. Microphones angled forward, fingers flew across keyboards. Social media had already sliced the exchange into 30-second clips, posted, reposted, captioned with phrases like, "The moment Jasmine Crockett turned the hearing upside down." She didn't argue a case, she became one. A sentence that will haunt Clarence Thomas. Inside the courtroom, however, Jasmine remained still. Stillness again. That quiet she carried like a second language. Refined, intentional, sharp. It was the same stillness she'd held as a young girl in the back of a police car, wrongly detained, hands cuffed behind her despite never raising her voice. She learned early that sometimes noise just gives power something to push against. But silence, that was different. Silence, when chosen, disorients the powerful, because it doesn't ask for approval. It just is. Across the bench, Clarence Thomas tapped his pen, slowly, rhythmically. He wasn't writing, he wasn't speaking. He was waiting. But for what? Even he didn't seem to know. The chairman leaned into his mic. We will now proceed to closing witness statements. Routine, scripted, almost hopeful, like trying to return to normalcy after an earthquake. But the room wasn't finished. In the gallery, someone coughed, a short, clipped sound that should have gone unnoticed. But it triggered a wave. People shifting, whispering. Not disruptive, but unmistakable. The kind of energy that happens when a crowd realizes something irreversible has taken place. And then, from the very back row, a voice. Say it again. Soft, cracked. A woman's voice, older. No one turned, but everyone heard it, because it wasn't a request for repetition. It was a plea for remembrance. Say it again. The part about not needing a robe to recognize injustice. The part about dignity. But Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't need to, because the room had begun to echo her. A slow, mounting awareness passed through the chamber like a current. And suddenly, the spotlight didn't belong to the bench. It belonged to the people watching from the margins. Those long told they were lucky just to be in the room. Jasmine folded her folder shut, quietly, reverently, like sealing something sacred. She turned to her right, toward the committee clerk, and handed over a slim slip of paper. Her final remarks printed not for performance, but for permanence. The clerk nodded, whispered thanks. But before Jasmine could sit again, Clarence Thomas raised a hand. Unscripted, not sharp, not arrogant, just raised. Like a man not accustomed to uncertainty, but suddenly aware he'd been carrying it all along. I'd like to ask the Congresswoman one final question, he said, voice lower now. The room tightened, a few gasps. One reporter muttered, he's going off script. Jasmine didn't flinch. Of course, she said. Thomas leaned forward, his tone not confrontational, not warm, just tentative. Do you believe the institution of this court is broken? It wasn't a trap, it was something worse. It was an invitation to lie, politely, to spare the room from the truth it had already felt. But Jasmine had never come to lie. She looked at him, really looked, and then said, I believe the court is not broken. I believe it's working exactly as it was designed, for the few at the cost of the many. Her words weren't angry, they were clean, and they hit like snowfall on glass, soft but loud enough to shatter silence. Just as Thomas blinked. Not confusion, not offense, recognition. He didn't respond, because what could he say? He had once said something similar. Decades ago, before the robe, before the silence became part of his legend, back when he, too, had felt institutions lean against him like locked doors. Now he was the one holding the keys, and he didn't know how to give them up without admitting what they had become. The gavel came down again, half-hearted this time. The chairman rose, others followed, but no one really left, not in the way hearings usually dissolve. This was something else, something unsettled. Jasmine stood, slowly, sliding her chair in with deliberate quiet, and as she turned to leave, a low, slow clap started from the gallery. Just one, then another. It wasn't applause, it was acknowledgement. Gasps, gavel, gallery, and now a new question hanging over the room. What happens when the person you tried to shrink becomes the mirror you can't look away from? The air outside the courthouse was humid with June heat, but inside it remained heavy with something colder. Memory. Not the kind etched in law books or historical markers, but the kind that follows people. The kind you don't always name, but never forget. Jasmine Crockett exited through the main doors without a word. Her steps were slow, deliberate, as if every movement required translation. Reporters followed like shadows, but none dared call her name. Not yet. Inside the courtroom, the bench sat empty now. Clarence Thomas had left without postscript, disappearing into the private corridor behind the panel like a figure retreating into a painting. But the echoes of what had been said, what had been shown, stayed behind like fingerprints on glass. The legal world was already splitting itself down predictable lines. Conservative commentators framed the moment as a political ambush, a grandstand of grievance. Progressive outlets declared it a watershed. Law students clipped Jasmine's final quote and posted it beside photos of Angela Davis, of Pauli Murray. But Jasmine didn't post anything. She didn't need to. Her words had already done the walking. That evening, C-SPAN aired a special segment titled The Reckoning on the Bench. Legal analysts debated judicial impartiality. Ethics experts danced around language like appearance of impropriety and legacy entanglements. But beneath the jargon was something simpler. Clarence Thomas had been reminded of his own origin story and didn't have an answer. Jasmine hadn't condemned him. She'd recalled him, reinserted his past into the present he now tried to float above. It wasn't just a reversal, it was an integration, a reckoning not only with hypocrisy, but with how easily power forgets its own ascent. And that's what made it devastating. Because the institution hadn't been challenged by a protest or petition, it had been cracked open by memory. The next day, Jasmine walked into her local district office in Dallas to a standing room only crowd. Constituents, clergy, young women, elders in wheelchairs. One man brought a frame. Inside it, a screenshot of her at the podium, eyes narrowed, hands still. Above it, he had printed the words, "You are not here because you serve the people." And beneath it in red marker, "But she does." She shook hands. She answered questions. She took no victory lap. Because this wasn't a win, it was a warning. The kind America issues every time someone outside the expected architecture of power dares to call the foundation into question. That week, the New York Times ran a Sunday feature, "Credentials and Control, the Quiet War in America's Highest Court." They didn't quote her. They quoted everyone around her. A retired judge. She didn't speak for the moment. She spoke to the centuries. A former law school professor. "We've trained generations to believe that decorum is more important than dignity." She reminded us they are not the same. But it was one voice, anonymous, buried near the end of the article, that carried the most weight. A former clerk for Justice Thomas. "She did what we never could," it read. "She made him feel seen again. Not celebrated, seen." Back in Washington, the committee met behind closed doors to discuss optics, ethics procedures, witness protocols. But the talk felt hollow now. You can't regulate something once it's remembered. And Jasmine had made the court remember not just its responsibilities, but its refusal, the refusal to see lived experience as evidence. The refusal to acknowledge how easily rules bend when robes sit over history, and the ultimate refusal to accept that credibility doesn't trickle down from titles. It rises from hardship, from survival, from every room where someone like Jasmine had once been asked for ID but not insight, and so she had named it, gently, fiercely, one sentence at a time, one silence after another. She didn't need to argue before the court because she had already argued through it, and by doing so reminded it and the nation that history doesn't belong to the ones who write it first. It belongs to those who dare to speak it after the verdict has already been handed down. The headlines faded, but the silence didn't. It lingered in corners of government buildings, in whispered calls between staffers, in faculty lounges and law firm lobbies, where someone always eventually asked, "Did you see what she said?" And then someone else always followed. She didn't even raise her voice. That was the part that stuck. Because America has always feared the spectacle of resistance. Raised fists, shouted chants, marching crowds, but it has a harder time knowing what to do when the defiance comes softly. When it sits down, crosses its legs, and names you without ever saying your name. That's what Jasmine Crockett had done. She didn't accuse the court. She exposed its choreography, and now those in power didn't know where to look. Even as hearings resumed the following week, a chill had set in, not from the weather, from exposure, from that subtle, suffocating awareness that something had been seen and could not be unseen. Reporters noticed it first. Fewer jokes in committee hallways, more careful phrasing, justices and members avoiding even casual references to merit or decorum when discussing underrepresented appointees. And then came the real signal, a delay in the release of new judicial ethics guidelines. Quiet, unannounced but deliberate. Because when institutions feel threatened, they don't announce their fear. They just pause, not because of what was said, but because of who said it and how clearly. Jasmine had not just survived the spectacle of erasure, she had refused to let it finish. A week later, she gave a talk at Howard Law. Not a press event, not a speech, just a round table. 30 students, most of them black, seated in a semicircle around her. No notes, no cameras, just her voice. "People think silence is surrender," she said. "But that's only true if you weren't planning to listen." One student raised her hand. "Were you afraid when he questioned you?" Jasmine paused, then answered with what she hadn't said in the hearing. "I wasn't afraid of him," she said. "I was afraid that if I didn't answer, every woman watching would think they had to stay quiet to stay safe." And there it was again. The tension. Not between people, but between power and truth. Between the story power tells about itself and the story that truth refuses to swallow. That's what had always been at stake in that hearing. Not just Jasmine's dignity, but the right to define credibility outside of whitewashed walls and Ivy League corridors. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, damage control had shifted into full motion. Unofficial memos circulated, media guidance on avoiding escalation language, private lobbying to move ethics debates behind closed doors. One senior staffer reportedly advised, "Let it fade, she had her moment." But Jasmine didn't treat it as a moment. She treated it as a message, and she kept going. Not with more press, with more listening. Back home in Texas, she visited 5 district courtrooms in 10 days. Not as a headline, not as a star, just as a witness. She sat in the back pews, took notes, watched how judges addressed young public defenders, how often they called defendants by case number instead of name. And after one session, she approached a young Latina lawyer fresh out of law school. No press, no stage. "Hold your stillness," Jasmine said. "It's not weakness, it's a weapon." What the media couldn't understand, what power still struggles to accept, is that Jasmine never needed to win the argument. She just needed to unmask the rules, the unwritten ones, the ones that say you need a clerkship to have a voice, that you need to sound like legacy to be heard, that the courtroom is neutral as long as you don't bring your whole self inside it. She had broken those rules without ever naming them. And in doing so, she broke something else, the performance of fairness. Because now the silence that once protected the system, its robes, its routines, its rituals, no longer felt like order. It felt like omission. Omission of who belongs. Omission of how we measure truth. Omission of the Mekong quiet war Black women have fought just to be allowed to speak without being labeled angry, unqualified, emotional, off topic. Now the institution had been named, and it was trying to hide again. But it was too late. Because Jasmine hadn't asked for space. She had claimed it. And from here forward, silence would never feel the same again. She stood at the edge of the Senate rotunda, arms crossed gently over a folder she didn't need to open anymore. The echo of footsteps, voices, hurried agendas, none of it touched her. Jasmine Crockett wasn't waiting to be called. She was watching the room. This was the same rotunda that had hosted presidents in caskets, generals in honor, and dozens of lawmakers who had told stories about freedom they themselves never had to earn. Now she stood beneath the dome, not to be remembered, but to remember. The hearing was over. The media cycle had moved on. But something quieter had settled across Capitol Hill, an unease too abstract to be scandal and too precise to be ignored. They'd tried, of course. Opinion columns shifted. Some praised her composure while subtly minimizing the substance. Others accused her of grandstanding under the guise of grievance. But their words couldn't reframe the thing they feared most. Jasmine had not backed down. She had paid a price, and paid it loudly. That week, a high-profile fundraiser she was scheduled to headline was postponed without explanation. A staffer she'd mentored got sidelined from a committee internship, and an anonymous op-ed appeared in the Wall Street Journal questioning whether decorum had lost its place among rising progressive voices. But Jasmine didn't flinch, because she knew what power does when it's cornered by truth. It finds new ways to punish without ever raising its hand. one quiet punishment at a time. But she had made her choice, and she knew the cost. The next month, when she returned home to Texas, an elderly man waited outside her district office, holding a photo from the 1960s, a grainy black and white shot of civil rights protesters facing down a courthouse door. "This," he said, holding the photo beside his chest, "was you, just quieter." Jasmine smiled softly, taking the photo without speaking, because that stillness, that particular stillness, wasn't just survival, it was inheritance. In the weeks that followed, others began to rise. A public defender in Baltimore who cited Jasmine's hearing transcript during a wrongful eviction appeal. A high school civics teacher in South Carolina who built a week-long module around the ethics of power. Even a small theater company in Oakland performed a one-act titled The Cross-Examination, based on Jasmine's lines, performed entirely in silence except for her final words. The system kept moving, but the silence inside it had changed. Now every pause felt heavier, not threatening, accountable, because someone had stood in front of power, been asked to shrink, and didn't. And that doesn't vanish with time. It settles. One evening, long after the headlines had cooled and the hearing was a footnote in official minutes, Jasmine sat on a bench overlooking the Anacostia River. No staff, no camera, just her and the sound of water brushing shoreline. A friend from law school joined her, sitting wordlessly for a moment before asking what everyone had wanted to ask. "Do you regret what you said to him?" Jasmine didn't look away from the water. "No," she said. "I regret how many years I waited before saying it." The wind passed softly, lifting her hair off her shoulders, and in that silence, uninterrupted, unquestioned, was the answer. This was never about Clarence Thomas. It wasn't even about the court. It was about the quiet contracts power signs with itself, and what happens when someone rips one of them in half, word by word, silence by silence. Jasmine had broken the spell, and the cost? Her comfort, her endorsements, her favor in rooms that would now rather forget her. But not her voice, and that was the price she paid. Not for victory, for clarity, for saying what too many others had swallowed, for reminding a nation that the measure of justice is not the title of who speaks, but the truth in what they say. She never asked for applause. And when it came, in brief waves and scattered hands and silent nods, she didn't stay to receive it. Jasmine Crockett had done what most never risk. She told the truth to power, not with fire, but with memory, not to win the room, but to reveal it. That courtroom, that question, that moment, it wasn't about who she was, it was about who we are, how we allow systems to mask their own fragility behind robes and rituals, how we measure credibility by the comfort of the speaker, not the clarity of the message. And when she sat in silence, when she refused to defend herself on someone else's terms, she did more than answer a question. She redefined the answer. Justice isn't dignified because it's dressed in tradition. It's dignified when it dares to hear the voices it once tried to silence. And sometimes the most powerful testimony doesn't come from a witness stand. It comes from a woman, still and steady, who refuses to step back. Even when the room was built to push her out, especially then. So remember this, not because it was viral or confrontational or unforgettable, but because it wasn't supposed to happen at all. She wasn't supposed to speak. She wasn't supposed to stay. She wasn't supposed to turn that question around. But she did. And now every courtroom, every hearing, every power that hides behind protocol will remember that moment, when silence stopped being permission and became resistance. Tell us what moment hit hardest. Share this story with someone who still thinks this never happens. Subscribe for stories that tell the truth, especially when it's uncomfortable. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative. Any resemblance to real events or individuals beyond public record is purely coincidental.